very much for the invitation to speak this evening. Maybe Ian will say more about this, but the headline statement really is only about 1,000 active commercial farms remain in the Sydney Basin. Now, I think I have to disagree a little bit with Fiona just now, because our work says that their output is relatively insignificant, except, as Fiona said, in a few categories like mushrooms, poultry, turf, pasture lands for recreational horses, and cut flowers. But I don't think there's much else. And in fact, our calculations show that the supermarket value of that slimy set of fruit and vegetables that are in the refrigerator crisper that we throw out each week probably exceeds the total weekly output value, which is about 20 million bucks or a billion per year. That output waste exceeds what the whole basin grows. But, and this is my point, food in Sydney is big business. Sydney has 30,000 workers in food manufacturing, 60,000 workers in food retailing, and 100,000 workers in cafes, restaurants, and fast food outlets. Food in Sydney is rich, it's corporate, it's industrial, it's advertising and consumption driven, and it's a complex supply chain. And that supply chain isn't local, it's long, it's heavily interstate, it's probably unsustainable in many ways, and in my opinion, it's fairly ordinary in terms of food quality. Now, Sydney has 4.5 million people. They have more square hectareage, meterage, I should say, although some of them measure their houses in hectares, more square meterage of housing than anywhere else in the world. Sydney will house 6 million people within the next 25 years, and according to Premier Barry O'Farrell, 50% of this additional population will live in new houses in greenfields areas. The targeted urban development sites will eliminate over 50% of those 1,000 farms. But urban growth has always eliminated farming in the Sydney Basin. So what's the big deal? Let's resort to the personal. When my family moved to Panania in Sydney's southwest in 1957, the new railway line through the area was lined with market gardens. An abandoned jam factory at Picnic Point still had stewed stone fruit in its giant cauldrons. One Sunday, I remember driving in our Vanguard to Camden, and I saw the magic of cows being milked on a merry-go-round. And then we picnicked like a good Catholic family in the grounds of a novitiate, or perhaps it was a monastery, and the word rotolacta has stuck in my mind ever since. And it's now hard to believe that the eternal presence of dairying and Catholicism in Sydney's southwest have disappeared, just like the Anthony Horden's oak tree. Occasionally, Dad cranked up the Vanguard to just drive a few kilometres on a Saturday morning to get chickens from the grower at Mulperra for special Sunday lunches. I remember their freshly snapped necks poked out of the rolled newspaper on the back seat on the way home, and their bodies were still warm. We took them to the laundry out the back, and we cleaned and plucked. And we carted buckets of steaming water from the house. And we learned that smelling and handling the guts of animals needed new words in our lives, like visceral. And we learned that while eating flesh could be a wonderful thing, especially around a joyful table, it required signing on to an acceptance of an earth-bound coupling of grain, animal life, and human toil. I remember too that the Sunday table carried tall bottles of Resch's dinner ale, and they would turn our best glassware frosty, and that my first sip of DA's foamy bitterness became my fondest childhood taste. And I could see and trace my dad's loyalty to Dr. Resch, as he called it, right down to those funny anti-competitive practices that made Panania Pub a Tide Resch's pub. But that meant I knew its beer came from the Waverley Brewery on South Dowling Street. And I knew what its heavy, hoppy, grainy, malty odours were as we walked through them on the way to the Sydney Cricket Ground. By the 1960s, the farmlands in our nook of the Georges River were gone. But when I rode through Marsfield and North Ryde on my motorbike on my way to Macquarie University in the 1970s, I could arrive home with a parcel under my jacket for Mum containing salad veggies or tomatoes or cut flowers. New houses in Panania and then North Ryde didn't mean the end of market gardening. The small farms just pushed westward and they occupied the new fringe, just like market gardening or truck farming does on the edges of cities all over the world. And as the farms moved, the farmers changed. In Panania and North Ryde, they were Italians. Macquarie University itself was built on 109 farms, 59 of which belonged to Italian families. But further west, the Maltese were taking over. And when I took my first job as a geography teacher at Riverston in the late 1970s, in the shadow of a meatworks and downwind from the tannery at Kellyville, we stopped on Friday mornings to buy still warm, freshly plucked chickens, this time from small Maltese growers at Schofields, every Friday morning for the staff chicken raffle at morning tea, and we loaded up the boot with corn and tomatoes and cucumbers and fresh eggs for the weekend. And so it continued. In the 80s and 90s, new migrants, the Vietnamese and the Chinese, and still new subdivisions, which meant new urban frontiers and new roads and cheap urban water, which generated new farming businesses, which provided modest cash returns only to the farmer, but the promise of capital gains to come. The perfect pathway to prosperity for the first generation migrant. Now, 2011, we face a last frontier, because now our urban fringe abuts floodplains, national parks, sandstone escarpments. Cheap water rights are gone. Cheap 5 and 10 acre parcels are gone. And our new migrants have business degrees and they work in finance, or they have medical degrees and they drive taxis, and they have no interest in a strained back or a sunburned neck. So now we have this controversy, the pending loss of 1,000 farms, and the raised concern of the inner elites in Sydney as if we've discovered a flock of endangered parrots on a rocky patch of grassland about to be bulldozed for an open-cut mine. And we cry out for governments to protect this last of a species. We hold crucifixes to the faces of the developers, and we scorn the McMansion dwellers. And we gather every first Saturday of the month in an inner-city car park, masquerading as a farmer's market. And we pop half a dozen kifla potatoes dripping with organically certified earth into a Hessian shopping bag. And we toddle off to spend about the same amount of money on the Saturday Sydney Morning Herald, and then twice as much again on single origin coffees on our way home to rest. And then we decide to forego the kiflas and spend 50 times more at the next fab local eatery and its fusion hydrocolloidal molecularised gastronomic menu with its Dino Giovanna chairs. And we feel good that we have done our bit to save the basin and the planet and all that we stand for. As I think seriously about how to save our 1,000 endangered parrots, I realise how tenuous Sydney-siders' food relationships have always been. 200 years ago, in 1811, the heavens opened in our basin just a few weeks ago, and a long prevailing severe drought was ended. A fresh surged down the Nepean River, and a colony of fresh food, a colony that needed fresh food was saved, and the local Darug people looked bemused at all the fuss. 100 years ago, in our first ever census, I saw today there were over 6,000 farmers on Sydney's fringe, for an entire basin population of just 630,000 people. Perhaps that was the golden age. But in general, our whitey Anglo traditions, call it culture if you dare, have lacked visceral engagement with a food supply chain as daily Sydney life, such that by 2011, our cleansed, shiny steel, glass and linoleum, air-conditioned, packaged, hygienic supermarket has become our barrier to the world of food. But it needn't be so. Last year, I lived for 7 months in two old university towns, Oxford in the south of England and Bologna in northern Italy. One place Bologna has never abandoned its viscerality, if there is such a word. The windows of our old top-floor apartment looked at the bells of San Stefano Cathedral through the exhaust chimneys of the Gambarini bakery. Our local Sfoglina worked by her street front window, her uncovered hands tying pasta squares with a paste of minced meat and offal and into tortellini. Our trattoria, called La Brasseria, turned wild boar into pig's trotter sausage, and we washed it down with Sangiovese di Romagna. And soon we understood that despite that giant food company Parmalat, which offers industrial foods in Italy's equally sanitised PAM supermarchetti, that local food supply chains had indeed survived the 20th century, and that outstanding local food was sold to queues of buyers, rich and poor, young and old, who every day, except for feast days, attend Bologna's covered markets, and that it will ever be thus. The other place, Oxford, is now rediscovering its local food supply chains. Its medieval covered market is sparking back to life. Fresh shot quail and grouse hang outside butcher shops. Local raspberries and apples taste divine. Local cheeses from, heaven forbid, unpasteurised local milk tell us what we could have back in Australia. But out in the countryside, things get very exciting. Drive along the A417 from Wantage to Wallingford, past the countryside cottages of Conservative MPs and News Limited editors and gastropubs with French chefs. And you can stop and buy local fruits and vegetables and lamb and beef and poultry and cheeses and local beer and cider and fresh-baked pies. And you don't need for much else in life, really, except for French wine, of course. The rub, though, is that you pay hefty prices to eat from the A417 food trail. But this isn't a problem for the very well-heeled burgers of Oxfordshire. If you're wealthy, then you can afford to boycott Tesco. And so a conclusion. Sure, there are good arguments to save Sydney's 1,000 threatened parrots. But even if protected, 1,000 won't create an enduring food supply chain like in Bologna. Sure, politicians must control developers. Regulators must rein in monopoly supermarket chains. Fledgling organic ethical food producers must be nurtured. But the powerful force for good is the consumer. We live in one of the world's wealthiest and well-educated cities. There is no greater impediment to the implementation of our food values than our consumption behaviours. We spend a load on food. The force for real change is in our wallets. It's up to us.